This is my home gym that cost me a total of around 1,400 euros, but the reason I'm calling it an 800 euro gym is because most of the additional costs came from the flooring and other small things that you don't really need or can be easily solved for much cheaper as well. It all started in the March of 2020 when I wanted a slight break from going to the gym and focus more on calisthenics, which led me to install gymnastic rings to the ceiling of my apartment, which in total cost me around 50 euros. Little did I know, however, completely coincidentally, less than a week later, something peculiar happened which caused all gyms to not operate for an extended period of time. So for several months, I just ran the bodyweight fitness recommended routine, primarily only using the rings. And honestly, I kinda enjoyed it in the sense that I found it really novel that I was able to do so much with such limited equipment. Well, at least for the upper body, because I really hated training the lower body with only shrimp and pistol squats. So for the first time in my life, I actually really started missing barbell squats. Which is why, once commercial gyms reopened, I once again went back to the squat, bench and deadlift instead of relying only on gymnastic rings. However, after a while, I found having to spend so much time on commuting to and from the gym a bit problematic. When I started considering the time I also had to spend on preparing my gym bag, changing clothes in the locker room, the commutes and workouts themselves and so on, an average trip took me over 3 hours in total, 6 times a week, making it literally like having a half-time job. So eventually, at the start of 2022, I decided to build a proper home gym by getting the least amount of equipment possible that would allow me to do as much as possible. So essentially, a power rack, a bench, a barbell, and some weights, which in total cost me around 800 euros brand new, which I'd personally say is quite cheap. Since I bought everything separately, the barbell and the weights were the first to arrive, and at the time, I was under a gamer's sleep schedule, so I went to sleep at 5 AM. But a delivery person called me that they were downstairs outside with the packages at 8 AM. So I had to quickly get up, put on winter clothes and start dragging all the weights and the barbell from a delivery truck to multiple floors up into my apartment during the winter when everything was covered with snow and ice. So it was kind of like one of those moments where you eat too much and you feel like you never want to see food again, except I felt that I never want to exercise again. What made it even worse was the fact that the plates smelled really bad. They had this really strong toxic rubber smell that eventually spread into my entire apartment, and just by touching one of the weights I could barely get the smell off my hands even with soap. I couldn't really fall asleep after that, so a few hours later I decided to once again get out of bed and try out the new equipment by doing some deadlifts, which was actually kinda cool to do in my own apartment. Oh, and also, as a note, in my apartment I had very thick walls and no downstairs neighbors. Anyway, to minimize the smell, I kept all the weights in the plastic wrappings that they came in, and over the following weeks and months, the smell basically disappeared. But I definitely recommend having proper ventilation if you're going to buy rubberized weights or flooring. Eventually, I also received the power rack, which after putting together, my home gym really started taking shape. But I was still missing the bench, so at one point I tried making some death trap in order to bench press. But before long, I just got a rather cheap but proper bench as well, and now I was finally able to use the gym for everything I wanted, and as you know, I eventually also moved the entire setup to the abandoned store. Anyway, before I actually review the gym equipment itself, I feel like it's more important to talk a bit about the experience of what it actually feels like to use a home gym instead of a retail gym. The first thing that's going to be very different is the environment. When you go to a commercial gym, you go in with a specific task in mind, which once you finish, you leave. Essentially, you go to an environment that exists for that purpose and that purpose only. With a home gym, however, the gym is in your home. This means that unless you have a dedicated room or building, such as a detached garage that you can dedicate for lifting, the environment can feel completely different and less stimulating at times, especially if the gym is on top of a soft carpet in the middle of your living room, next to your computer, bed, couch and kitchen, which can sometimes make it quite hard to get to the proper headspace required for lifting. At home, it's much easier to get distracted and stop early on days where you have a lot going on and you don't feel as motivated towards the gym, especially when you were supposed to have a very difficult and long session lasting potentially 2 hours. It can be especially bad when you feel really tired after working on the computer for 10 hours straight, making the room feel stuffy because it lacks oxygen due to not having proper ventilation, or it's too hot or too cold. At times like that, the change of environment and the walking you have to do to get to a commercial gym can definitely help. Otherwise, starting a 5x5 squat session with 85% of your 1 rep max in the same room is going to be the last thing that you want to do. Which is why, if possible, I'd really recommend having a dedicated room for the gym. In fact, I enjoyed my home gym the most back when the abandoned store was essentially just I once again live in the same room as the gym, and while this time it's definitely better than it was in my comfy carpet apartment, I still really appreciate the short walk and the change of environment that I get from going to a nearby retail gym that I recently started lifting at for the sake of variety and access to additional equipment. One day, when this big storage room gets more renovations, I'll probably just put my home gym here instead, which would most likely solve most of these problems, because it would once again become a dedicated space just for the gym, and I'd also have more space for more equipment as well. Anyway, I'd also like to say something about whether or not you should actually get a home gym. If you have never lifted in your life and have easy access to a commercial gym, I'd much rather recommend that you first try going there instead of going all out on getting a home gym just for it to become a clothes drying rack for the next 2 decades. Not just that, but I'd actually recommend that once you have already some experience with working out regularly at a commercial gym, you should also try working out at home for a while with bodyweight or whatever equipment you have, because like I said, the environment is very different and it's also hard to decide what equipment you actually want or need if you have no experience. I myself got the home gym only after I had already been going to commercial gyms regularly for over 5 years. At the time, I had been doing a 6-day per week maximalist program for around 25 weeks straight without skipping a single day, so the amount of time I was spending on commutes and whatnot had started to become too extreme, which was the final thing that pushed me towards building a home gym in my tiny apartment. And like I said before, I already had experience with working out at home for an extended period of time, and I also knew exactly what equipment I wanted or needed for the programs that I was going to run. Essentially, my mindset was that I was going to be lifting for the rest of my life, so if I do end up getting a home gym, I already knew that I was most definitely going to be using it even during times of low motivation, because I knew myself well enough when it came to lifting, as well as that I was disciplined enough to do so. If you're currently going to a commercial gym and find yourself constantly skipping days because you don't feel like going, a home gym will not change that. You'll still feel just as demotivated as before, except now the environment might be also less productive, which might make you sandbag and cut your workout short because you're already at home anyway. Although, for myself, the amount of skip days definitely got shorter once I got my home gym, because I had less excuses such as the gym being closed or not having enough time to make the commute today. Ultimately though, while my experience with commercial gyms isn't necessarily negative, having a home gym is still what I prefer. The amount of time and eventually money that you can save by having a home gym is fantastic. In fact, the buyer's remorse that I had in the beginning quickly turned around, making the home gym one of my favorite purchases that I've ever made. Even if I'd like to get rid of it one day, I can still sell it for around the same price, if not even higher than I bought it for, as not only is the demand for home gyms growing, but the materials are also getting more expensive to manufacture and ship. So anyway, to actually review the equipment, I'd like to start off with the powerrack, because I think that's the hardest thing to choose aside from the flooring. So the powerrack I have is essentially by some no-name brand, and I bought it for 179 euros, which was the cheapest powerrack I could find at the time, but by now even this one has gone back to 350 euros. I really like its minimalistic design and the fact that it just has a simple, clean bar for doing pull-ups and so on, as well as the weight holders that also make the rack more stable. Now, some of you might be thinking that buying a cheap power rack is dumb because they might be dangerous, which is something that I was also worried about, considering that the actual heavy-duty power racks all started from well over 8,000 euros. But luckily it came out that for my usage, there is nothing really dangerous about this rack. The J-hooks are rated for 100 kilos each, so 200 kilos in total, but even when I slammed 200 kilos onto them, it still really feels like they can handle a bit more. This is most likely because the companies are actually lowering the max capacity on paper for safety purposes, not the other way around. But don't quote me on that. All I know is that it can handle the weights that I'm personally using even in the worst case scenarios. Also, there is this video by Garage Gym Reviews where he drops a barbell weighing well over 300 kilos onto the cheapest Amazon power rack costing $250 and essentially nothing happened. Of course, if you're lifting extremely heavy, then you're probably still better off getting a heavy duty one just to be sure. I'm able to do quite a lot with this power rack. In fact, I even used to do dips on top of it, but unfortunately here the ceiling is a bit too low for that, so if you do want to do things like muscle ups and so on, you should probably take that into consideration. The main thing I don't like about this power rack though is that when I add or remove the safety rails, I'm basically forced to scratch off the paint each time, because otherwise it just doesn't fit through the holes. So expect coated safety rails to immediately get scratched up, as well as to have paint dust fall all over the floor. I actually put some plastic bags into the holes to prevent that at one point, which sort of worked, but when I moved here I just didn't bother anymore. I assume that this issue would pretty much be solved if the coated safety rails would just be replaced with uncoated raw ones, or if you just remove the paint off them yourself. The other thing is that the rack is a bit short in terms of depth, which sometimes makes it easy to accidentally slam the barbell into the back of the support poles of the rack, as well as that the pipes and poles that make up the construction of the rack can be a bit crooked or bent, but honestly, neither of those things are that big of a deal. Also, I have to overhead press in front of the rack because it's too short for me to overhead press inside of it. Overall though, I'm pretty satisfied with this particular budget power rack, and I have no interest in changing or upgrading it simply because at the end of the day, even if I did, it wouldn't change my workouts in any way regardless. Next, we have the barbell from Hazy Pro, which is a company here that makes some pretty decent products at pretty good prices. But I assume that this one is just some standard barbell that different companies can order from the same factory and put their own sticker on. However, despite that, it's actually really solid and feels quite premium. The knurling isn't super rough, but it's okay, and the bar is quite stiff in the sense that with the weights that I use, it barely bends at all. I don't know how much it cost, because I actually bought it alongside a massively discounted combo bundle with the weights for a total of 500 euros with free shipping, but I assume that if I bought it separately, it would have cost something between 200 to 400 euros. Speaking of the weights included in the combo were these rubberized color-coded ones that are pretty decent. They don't really slide too much, but not too little either, and they're easy to grab, and overall, the smell that they originally had has pretty much disappeared, so I don't really have anything negative to say about them, except that when deadlifting, they do slouch a bit, but not as badly as many other non-bumper plates. They also make this cool sound. As for the bench, it's once again by some random company, and it cost me 120 euros, which was once again the cheapest option available at the time. One thing that I was very particular about was that I wanted the bench to be as rectangular as possible. I didn't want some random curves in it, because not only do they look ugly, but also because they get in the way of bench pressing, which is the primary purpose that I bought the bench for. It definitely isn't as high quality as the benches in commercial gyms, as it only weighs around 15 kilos, but that being said, I'm completely comfortable with benching with it, as it doesn't really feel like it's going to break at all. In fact, if I go to failure, I often stand on the bench and deadlift the weight up, which is definitely pushing its limit, but it still hasn't broken on me, and I usually use safety rails anyway, even if it did, but I doubt it will. Here we have some dumbbells. These particular ones are from the Soviet era that already existed in this abandoned store for decades, and they're still completely usable. There actually used to be a Soviet era barbell with around 80 kilos of weights as well, but it was sold a few years ago as it wasn't really super standard, so it would have been really hard to find a squat rack and additional weights for it. Then I have an additional set of modern dumbbells that I got for free, and these are the ones that many people have, as well as hate, because they tend to unscrew themselves mid-set, making this annoying noise when the blades start moving around. But I discovered this cool tip that when you screw them by grabbing the blades instead of the collar, you can actually get rid of that problem pretty well. I actually wish that I had more blades for them, because they're definitely pretty handy. In fact, I used to use the standard blades for them at one point, which sort of worked, but wasn't ideal. Eventually though, I just bought some loadable dumbbells, which are extremely valuable for a home gym because they're cheap and you can just load them up with the blades that you already have without needing to get an entire dumbbell rack nor some expensive and finicky adjustable dumbbells. My only problem with them is that they're rather long, so they tend to bump into each other unless you hold your hands in a neutral position. There are shorter ones being sold as well, but those mostly only make the loadable part shorter, which can be fine, but personally I wish that instead the handle was a bit shorter, because I definitely don't need it to be that long and it does contribute to the overall length quite a bit. At one point, I also went ahead and bought additional 1.25 and 2.5 kilo plates so I could properly match the amount of weight on both of these loadable dumbbells, and I also went ahead and bought an additional pair of collars, which you're definitely going to need with these dumbbells. Then I also have an ab roller that I got for free, but rarely use in my current programs, as well as a dip belt for weighted calisthenics and a regular belt that once again I got for free. But it's so small that I had to make additional holes in it, but it's still pretty hard to put on and to remove, though I've pretty much figured it out by now. My biggest problem with this belt though is that it's quite large and stiff, which can be good, but occasionally I feel like it limits mobility too much, especially on something like bench press, and sometimes the metal part pinches my skin during squats, which can be extremely distracting. I always have to check for that first, which is why I recently kind of just prefer doing all my lifts beltless. I still have the rings from earlier in the video, and they're pretty good, except that sometimes it's annoying to get both sides perfectly lined up, and I've noticed that there is a wooden part sticking out here, which can be potentially pretty bad. Other than that, I also got some random foam pads that I found laying around here, a foam roller, and a few cheap bands that can come in handy for isolation exercises. However, I really wish that I also had a cable machine, because the resistance curve and overall weight of bands isn't always the most desirable, and when you do unilateral or even lateral movements, it sometimes feels like the stimulus is inconsistent between the two sides, and they're also really hard to keep track of and progressively overload. And now, finally, the flooring. This is a 50mm thick flooring made from recycled tires, and it cost me around 475 euros, which is quite a lot. A lot of people recommend buying stall mats used for horses, tractors and so on, but it wasn't really easy to get those here, and they, as well as the many alternatives online, were potentially a bit too thin, as most of them were only 10 to 20mm thick, and even though there was a 30mm variant as well, which maybe would have been enough, but the 50mm ones were surely the safest and didn't cost all that much extra, and in my opinion looked a lot better as well, so I just ended up going with those. Though I gotta admit, if I really wanted, I could have gotten away with only 2 mats for deadlifting, or just enough to cover the bottom of the power rack. But it's still nice to have a consistent safe flooring that's dedicated for the gym that I never have to worry about. When I received this flooring, it also smelled a bit, but it disappeared really fast, and overall the smell wasn't nearly as bad as the plates were. In fact, I kind of even liked the smell of the flooring, as it was more like a smell of a new product rather than toxic waste, although I still ventilated the room as much as possible just in case. Overall, my advice for flooring is to figure it out for yourself. I mean, at first I was literally deadlifting on top of layers of cardboard, and that worked pretty well as long as I was controlling the negative, except for when the bar started occasionally rolling away mid-set. So I guess actually it wasn't all that ideal after all. And that pretty much concludes my home gym review and my general thoughts on how you should approach getting a home gym. Overall, if I were to add something to this gym, I'd mostly just want a proper adjustable cable machine setup as well, but other than that, I'm pretty much set. Currently, like I said, I'm mainly going to a commercial gym just to check it out and for the sake of variety, but that's mostly just a temporary thing because I'm sure that I'll be back to using my home gym full time in the future. So I hope this video helped, and if you are building your own home gym, then I wish you luck on getting the home gym that you'll be happy with.